It's one of the most dangerous places on Earth, where each journey felt like a death sentence. Waves tower over 65 feet, and icy hurricane-force winds tear across the sea. Rescue is nearly impossible, with no land in sight for hundreds of miles. Thousands have perished in these unforgiving waters, and making it out alive is nothing short of a miracle. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're diving into the deadliest stretch of ocean you have probably never heard of: the Drake Passage. When Alfred Lansing described explorer Ernest Shackleton's 1916 voyage across the Drake Passage in a lifeboat, we'll get into that insanity later, he described it as the most dreaded bit of ocean on the globe, and rightly so. This 600-mile body of water is found between Cape Horn on the southern tip of South America and the South Shetland Islands, which are located right above Antarctica. Though the Drake Passage has an average depth of around 11,000 feet, its northern and southern boundaries slope down even lower, reaching depths of 15,600 feet. That is 4/5 the height of Mount Kilimanjaro. In other words, it's a place you definitely don't want to be left swimming in open water. Named after the famed explorer Sir Francis Drake, though the first person to cross it was actually the Flemish explorer Willem Schouten in 1616. The waterway has also gained a reputation as the most dangerous, deadly sea passage in the world. So the first big question is, why do people still sail it? For centuries, Drake Passage was the only connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, underneath the continent of South America. Until the Panama Canal was built, there was simply no other way to get cargo from one side of the Americas to the other by ship, and overland transport was incredibly costly. And those sailors braved a lot to make their way around the Horn. In fact, there's a monument on the edge of Cape Horn commemorating over 10,000 sailors thought to have lost their lives here. Though, as you'll see later, the true number is probably much higher. Thanks to a perfect storm of environmental and climate factors that all come together, Drake Passage experiences some of the strongest ocean currents in the world. The passage is located between about 56 degrees latitude and 62 degrees latitude south. The area is in the 50s latitude and is home to ultra-strong westerly winds that whip their way around the globe, which is why this band around the Earth is nicknamed the Furious 50s. It causes massive swells and powerful storms that wreak havoc on both ships and land. However, these storms hit Drake Passage even harder, as when they make their way all the way around the Earth, there's no land to slow down their progress. When a hurricane makes landfall, it begins to weaken, cut off from the warm ocean waters that fuel it, and slowed by the friction of the land, trees, and other man-made structures. But this doesn't happen in Drake Passage. The southernmost point of Australia lies at 39 degrees latitude south, and the southernmost point of South Africa lies at 34 degrees 50 minutes south. As oceanographer Alexander Brearley says, it's the only place in the world where those winds can push all around the globe without hitting land, and land tends to dampen storms. So the winds just circle the world, and then kinetic energy is converted from wind into waves and build up storm waves, according to Brearley. On a regular stormy day, this can easily create waves up to 30 feet tall. On more irregular days, sailors and passengers have observed towering rogue waves that are 65 feet and in some cases even 80 feet tall, hurtling toward them. These conditions are known as the Drake Shake because the sea smashing your furniture across the room and making you violently throw up wasn't that cute of a nickname. And you can expect the Drake Shake about 30% of the time you're crossing the passage. Even on not particularly stormy days, the mean wave height in Drake Passage is still around 13 to 16 feet tall, which is double the mean wave height of the Atlantic Ocean, and more than twice the height of your average basketball player. If you're looking into booking a trip anyway to test your seasickness, know that stormy weather is more likely in the winter. If you're a passenger on the water in the summer, you may experience a phenomenon known as Drake Lake. This is where the sea is calm and quiet and less likely to reintroduce you to your lunch. While these crazy winds also cause bad storms and waves under South Africa and Australia, there are no major shipping routes on those seas. Sailors have never really needed to navigate those passages, at least not for centuries, as the existence of the Suez Canal and the warm waters between the Indian and Pacific Oceans have rendered it unnecessary. And that's why Drake Passage is specifically so feared by those on the seas. On top of that, there's another phenomenon that makes Drake Passage even more dangerous: the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, known as the strongest ocean current on Earth. This current is so unbelievably powerful that it moves 4.9 billion cubic feet of water through the passage per second. That is 3.5 Olympic swimming pools being rushed through per minute. And when the Pacific Ocean meets the Atlantic Ocean under South America, the gap between the land masses suddenly narrows. And this is where the Antarctic Peninsula pokes north from the continent here, and Cape Horn stretches downward. So that super fast, super strong current funnels through this 600-mile wide passage, getting even stronger in the process. That's why the strongest recorded current in the world passed through here at 40 knots or 46 miles per hour at its peak. And the land under the sea doesn't help matters either. Miles under the surface, you'll find underwater mountains known as the Shackleton Fracture Zone, or SFZ. This is an intra-ocean ridge found at about the midpoint of the passage, which alternates deep valleys with prominent ridges that rise anywhere from hundreds to several thousand meters above the ocean floor. So, not only is the very voluminous current found in Drake Passage being squeezed sideways between two land masses, it's also being squeezed underneath by mountains pushing it up toward the surface of the ocean. It's a perfect storm of circumstances to create, well, perfect storms. No wonder some scientists estimate that the passage has claimed many more lives than the Cape Horn Memorial notes. Close to 20,000 people drowned in its waters and 800 ships total. That number makes more sense when you take into account how many ships had to go through the passage in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and how many sailors worked on those ships. For example, just one disaster in 1819 claimed 644 lives. In September of that year, the San Telmo was crossing the passage to get to Peru. Captain Joaquin de Toledo was leading the ship and the hundreds of sailors under him when they were unexpectedly caught in horrifically bad weather. The weather in Drake Passage can change in an instant, from calm waters to brewing storms. Obviously, meteorology in 1819 didn't have quite the advanced tech that we use now to let Captain Joaquin know that they were sailing right into a storm. Predictably, the storm blew the San Telmo way off course. Caught in the waves and unable to make its way out of the passage, it sank in one of the biggest naval disasters in history, with 644 men sent to their deaths in the depths of the ocean. That makes it all the more awe-inspiring when you consider that Irish explorer Ernest Shackleton made his way through the Drake Passage on a lifeboat. Granted, it wasn't by choice. In 1914, Shackleton and 27 of his men had set sail on a much bigger ship, the Endurance, from South Georgia to Vassal Bay, Antarctica. At least that was the plan. But as they sailed farther south and they got to mostly unmapped territory, they found themselves caught by ice. By January 18, 1815, the Endurance was completely frozen in place and basically being used as a combination base and station by the men. This kept them alive for a while, barely, until October of that year. After a harsh Antarctic winter, with the ice expanding and thickening, the conditions had become too harsh for the ship to bear. The Endurance, the only hope for the men's temporary survival, started going down into the icy sea. The men set up camp on the ice for a couple of months, but Shackleton knew this was not a long-term solution to their problem. So when the ice floe broke up, he gathered his crew and their lifeboats and they made their way to Elephant Island, part of the South Shetland Islands. Granted, life on a freezing, barren, remote island wasn't exactly a huge improvement in the men's situation, so Shackleton, feeling some combination of desperation and bravery, took 5 of his men and set out on a lifeboat to cross the entire passage and get to South Georgia. Storms and waves tossed them about, and hurricane-force winds sprayed ice-cold water into their faces daily. At this point, the men with Shackleton must have been wondering if they would be better off dying of hunger on Elephant Island after all. However, 14 days later, at this point, the almost unimaginable happened. The crew spotted land. They had made their way to South Georgia, somehow navigating a lifeboat across one of the most fearsome seas on Earth, while caught in several storms. After the crew kissed the ground for a while, Shackleton organized a rescue expedition for the rest of the men stuck on Elephant Island to bring them to safety. If you try to cross Drake Passage today, you can count on a much less harrowing and dangerous journey. Most people traveling the passage are making their way from Ushuaia, the southernmost city in Argentina, to Antarctica. The voyage takes about 48 hours, though in bad weather it has taken ships up to 6 days to cross due to delays, having to hold in certain parts until the bad weather passes. The good news is, with modern shipbuilding technology and weather prediction systems, the journey across the passage has become much safer than it used to be. Polar-class hulls, reinforced with extra steel and shaped with ice-breaking bows, are designed to withstand the crushing pressure of Antarctic ice, making navigation through frozen waters far easier. Advanced stabilization systems also help make the journey not only safer, but smoother for passengers who wish to cross the passage and see Antarctica. In addition, advanced meteorological forecasts help ships avoid the worst of the passage's weather. Captain Stanislaus Dvorcin, who frequently crosses the Drake Passage, says he and his crew start planning the voyage days ahead of time, 10 days or a week before at the latest. He adds, "I check the forecast once per day, then 2 or 3 days before departure I start looking at it twice per day. When we cross and it's going to be challenging, we have a big safety margin and the ship is not at all in danger. Communications equipment like high-level satellite antenna, as well as satellite and radio backup, keep captains like Deversign in contact with headquarters the whole time. That is, assuming they can use them, but we'll get to that later. Because the journey still isn't without risks, people have died due to the horrific conditions on the Drake Passage as recently as 2022, when a massive wave crashed into a Viking Polaris ship, smashing through one of the windows and killing an American tourist with the glass. 4 other people were also injured. Not to mention, if you get thrown off of a ship on the passage, your chances of survival are not great. The surface temperature of the water varies from around 43 degrees Fahrenheit in the northern part of the passage to below freezing at 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the south. The temperature changes drastically at around latitude 60 degrees south, the zone of Antarctic convergence. The convergence is the boundary between Antarctic waters and subantarctic waters, creating such different ecosystems that many species and plants found on one side of this latitude line are not found on the other side. Strangely, it also has a pretty positive effect on the climate in general, as the cooling power of the convergence zone makes Drake Passage one of the world's largest carbon sinks. According to Lillian Dove, a NOAA Climate and Global Change postdoctoral fellow at Brown University, the ocean in this region is less stratified due to strong winds and the SFZ. As a result, phytoplankton that normally float near the surface and capture carbon are pushed deep into the ocean, taking the captured carbon down with them. Though the exact amount of carbon the passage captures varies a lot year to year, it is one of the Southern Ocean's prime carbon sequestration spots. Altogether, the Southern Ocean removes 550 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere annually, 1/6 of all the carbon spewed out into the world by human activities. This is great news for keeping Antarctica cold and stopping it from completely melting, which would inundate the world with an extra 195 feet of water. It also creates ecosystems for the local krill, whales, and other species. But the extra cold water is less positive news if you just got swept overboard. In waters of 32.5 degrees Fahrenheit, death from hypothermia can occur in as fast as 15 to 45 minutes. And we will remind you that the southernmost part of Drake Passage is even colder than that. And you'll likely become hypothermic much faster than that. As in any cold water below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, hypothermia sets in at 10 to 15 minutes max. This will gradually cause unconsciousness, making things like swimming or just staying afloat impossible, especially with 30-foot waves battering you constantly. As for those on a ship in Drake Passage, they're not completely free of danger either, even with all of our modern technology, weather prediction systems, and rescue services. In 2010, another incident happened when the cruise ship Clelia II was returning from Antarctica to Ushuaia. The ship encountered unexpectedly bad conditions. They were so bad that even the ship's captain, who had 159 Antarctic trips under his belt, said he had never seen such weather. Something you definitely don't want to hear from the man who has your life in his hands. The captain had made a potentially fatal mistake, even though he knew there was a massive storm brewing across the passage, one that his ship was not prepared to handle. His passengers had been pressuring the crew to get back to Argentina quickly so they could make their flights. Waves crashed over the ship and flooded the bridge, resulting in a loss of power steering. And then the weather completely took out the engine. Because the Clelia II was apparently cursed, an errant wave caused a beam to crash through the navigation center, flooding everything in the area and shutting down all the communication to the outside world. Stranded in the middle of the Drake Passage, the ship was at the mercy of the Antarctic's painful winds and angry swells. The ship was pummeled by the sea, with 88 passengers and 77 crew members watching 30-foot waves completely cover their windows and wondering what was going to happen to them. Thankfully, they were about to get their first bit of luck. Another ship, the National Geographic Explorer, was sailing in the area of the Clelia II. Coincidentally, writer Angela Dansby was on the National Geographic Explorer and recounted the story of the ship's rescue. It was such a stormy day that ropes had been placed in her ship to help people navigate their way around the halls and dining areas. Paper plates were given out to prevent the storm from starting an unexpected Greek plate-smashing celebration on the Explorer. By noon, the captain of the ship had ordered all passengers to remain in their cabins, preferably horizontal, and Happy Feet was playing on the TV, so animated dancing penguins could distract the passengers from the motion sickness and thoughts of their potential imminent death. Dansby recalls that suddenly the expedition's leader's voice popped up on the PA system with the following announcement: "We must go into the eye of the storm to help this ship. We are the closest to it, and maritime rules call for it. We will serve you lunch under your doors." Though most passengers stayed in their rooms, Dansby was curious to see what was happening and get a glimpse of the other cruise ship. When they finally approached the Clelia 2, the scene looked like something out of a movie. She says, "We watched in horror as it limped along the ocean, being thrashed into huge waves while bouncing up and down." Apparently, the National Geographic Explorer had attempted to communicate with the stricken vessel to make sure everything was all right. When the captain got no response, he realized something must be wrong and chose to approach. It was also a good thing that the Nat Geo Explorer captain had several backup satellite phones on him, because while the captain of the Clelia 2 had a satellite phone, he hadn't paid his phone bill, and therefore he didn't have service. Now that is one reason to remember to pay your bills on time. Since the Explorer's thankfully Type A captain had 9 satellite phones, he decided to send one over to the Clelia 2. However, in 30-foot waves, it's not like you could just rock up to the deck and toss one over. The captain actually used rocket launchers to try to get the satellite phones over to the Clelia's deck, which honestly sounds pretty awesome. The Explorer's crew duct-taped the satellite phone to a string and launched it over the bow toward the Clelia 2. The first time, it missed. The second time came close, but it also fell short of its mark. However, the third time was a charm. The Clelia's captain now had communications, and the Explorer notified the Argentinian and Chilean Coast Guards that they should probably come by and bail out the powerless ship. No word on whether the passengers made their flights. Now you might be thinking, if the Clelia 2 hadn't been rescued by a nearby ship and the Coast Guard, and had a satellite phone they could have used, couldn't helicopters just come by and pick up the crew and its passengers? Well, it turns out, not really. While flying over Drake Passage is possible, small planes fly people out from Punta Arenas or Punta Natales all the time. It's not a choice that you want to make in stormy weather. First of all, according to Vertical Mag, helicopter operations in cold conditions present a formidable challenge for pilots, operators, and maintenance crews. Helicopters, more so than any other aircraft, are uniquely vulnerable to these threats. And as you could imagine, cold conditions are pretty much the norm in Drake Passage. When the temperatures are between 32 and -4 degrees Fahrenheit, icing conditions occur, causing potentially fatal conditions for helicopter flights. Basically, the moisture in the air turns into ice when it comes into contact with the helicopter itself. If the ice accumulates on the craft's rotor blades or the engine inlets and sensors, that spells trouble for the pilot. Ice can increase drag, decrease lift of the helicopter, or catastrophically affect the functioning of the engine and rotor blades. You know, those things that keep the helicopter in the air. Considering the average air temperature in Drake Passage ranges between 41 degrees Fahrenheit in the north and 26 degrees to the south, it's not that great news for helicopter rescues, especially if you happen to need assistance in the southern part of the passage, which almost guarantees icing conditions. Not to mention, if the passengers are in need of emergency rescue, it's likely that the weather conditions are pretty bad to start with. Getting a helicopter close enough to the surface of the water to rescue people while apartment building-sized waves are crashing about is not the easiest of tasks. One ship stranded in Antarctic ice in 2013 found this out the hard way when they had to wait over a week to get helicopter support. The Russian vessel Akademik Shokalskaya had 74 scientists, crew members, and tourists on board when it became trapped in the ice on Christmas Eve. A nearby Chinese icebreaker with the epic name Snow Dragon had a helicopter on board ready to assist. However, the Australian maritime authorities coordinating the rescue said the helicopter would have to wait for over a week for a break in the weather to even attempt to start airlifting people from the research ship. Due to poor visibility and bad weather, the helicopter simply couldn't take off earlier. After all, unlike airplanes, helicopters need really good visibility to fly safely. That rescue took time, and it involved a stationary ship and a helicopter landing on a makeshift helipad on solid ice. Now, in the middle of the stormy, swelling seas of the Drake Passage, pulling off a rescue like that would be 10 times harder, if not impossible. The moral of the story is, try to avoid crossing the Drake Passage, and if you do, don't get thrown overboard or caught in a storm or in the ice. Surviving the Drake Passage is nearly impossible, but what about being stranded in the open ocean with no ship at all? Check out how one man survived 133 days lost at sea on a life raft, or click on this video instead.